It's October 27th of 2020, and what seemed like a typical Tuesday at work unfolds at the Lake Oliver Dam, located near the fall line of the Chattahoochee River, right in the middle of Columbus, Georgia. Two seasoned professionals, Alex Reed Paxton and Eric Herbert, have made their way to the dam site to carry out some routine checks. They're employed by Glenn Industrial Group, a company specializing in contracts for underwater maintenance systems. According to the initial rundown of their task, Eric and Alex were informed that one of the operating chains on a specific floodgate was malfunctioning, most likely because it snapped. The two were supposed to dive deep and pinpoint where exactly the situation had gone wrong so that a proper plan could be made for the necessary repairs. This was a very usual task, but given the nature of their jobs, there were inherent risks involved as well. One of the biggest risks to consider was the differential water pressure. To grasp this phenomenon in the context of dams, imagine having two colossal water tanks, each as big as a swimming pool connected by a really narrow pipe. One tank is filled to the brim, while the other remains empty. When you open the valve between them, a relentless torrent of water surges through the pipe from the full tank to the empty one. When this water flows, the pressure in the full tank plunges to extremely negative levels as it drains out. Meanwhile, the empty tank's pressure skyrockets rapidly as it fills. This stark contrast between pressure in the two tanks is known as differential pressure, or delta P. On top of that, the sheer force of the water being blasted through the narrow pipe is also incredibly powerful because it's being squeezed from a vast expanse into a tiny opening, then back out again into the open space. So the intense concentration of force acts like a monstrous vacuum cleaner, pulling anything unfortunate enough to get in its way with a terrifying suction mechanism. So to steer clear of calamity before sending divers inside the dam, it's made sure that no switches are left open inside. And for that, the most crucial pre-dive effort is to identify all the points on these valves where potential pressure differences could be present. The points are then labeled with a tag so that no one lays a finger on them until the tag is taken off after the repairs. Then comes the paperwork. All the tagged points are also added to a checklist, which is then given the green light by supervising dam employees and then by the officials of the repairing company. This whole process is known as the lockout-tagout process, or LOTO. On the fateful day of October 27th of 2020, the LOTO procedures were wrapped up by the Lake Oliver Dam employees, and a total of 4 points were listed and double-checked after being tagged out for maintenance. 3 of them were the main gates, while the 4th one was something called the penstock priming valve. This valve, connected to an even smaller pipe, was used to prime the penstock before the main gate swung open. If the penstock were to be completely empty when the gate is opened, a massive surge of water would forcefully enter the chamber, potentially causing damage to the turbine located at the end. So, to avoid the water from rushing in too quickly, this little priming pipe allows a smaller amount of water to enter the penstock and fill it up before the dam starts working at full throttle. While the LOTO checklist concluded detailing only 3 head gates and 1 priming valve, what the dam employees completely overlooked was another crucial priming valve that remains unaccounted for, neither closed nor tagged. Meanwhile, Alex and Eric, convinced that all pre-dive protocols had been meticulously followed, geared up for their final task ahead. However, prior to entering the dam, they conducted their own final check, scanning for any signs of differential pressures as per the LOTO checklist. But as anticipated, they found no sign of the missing point, as it wasn't even listed. After dropping their meters into the water and confirming stability at the 4 tagged locations, they felt confident in their assessment. So, positioned above Gate 3, they prepared themselves mentally for their next steps into the dam. Upon declaring who would enter the dam first and who would oversee from above, Alex stepped forward, volunteering to dive, leaving Eric to supervise from outside. However, what Alex couldn't have imagined in that moment was that his decision to volunteer would lead him down a path filled with unforeseen and ominous events. He dismissed Eric and dove in to investigate the situation. What adds a chilling layer to this story was that Alex was equipped with a helmet camera and a light setup, intending to document his findings for the company's records, unaware that this very camera would capture his final, unsettling moments just a short while later. Descending further into the depths, the footage from Alex's GoPro initially captures routine instructions from Eric through their communication gear, with Alex responding and affirming directions. As he continued deeper, he surpassed the 20-foot mark. Everything appeared normal, just as expected, until it suddenly wasn't. Seconds later, the camera captured violent bubbles and deafening noise in the vicinity for what felt like an eternity. Alex's hysterical screams pierced the video, reaching Eric on the other side of the line. Desperate to understand what had happened, Eric shouted Alex's name. Through the turbulent noise, Alex only managed to convey, "I'm stuck." However, the cacophony drowned out his words, and Eric had to ask again. Alex repeated himself, revealing his dire situation. In that moment of confusion and panic, neither Eric nor the dam crew, nor Alex himself, comprehended the full extent of the horror unfolding. It was only when Eric and the team outside the dam attempted to pull Alex to safety using a tether that the chilling truth began to show. Unbeknownst to Alex, he had inadvertently approached the open, unchecked priming valve. The valve's suction created an unforgiving vortex that ensnared him in a matter of seconds, but the pipe's narrow 10-inch opening only allowed his left arm to be drawn in, while the rest of his body was mercilessly pinned against the unyielding dam wall. The crushing force exerted, estimated at a staggering 850 pounds per square inch, imposed a pressure equal to the combined weight of 14 adult African elephants, pressing down on his chest. His bones buckled under the relentless strain, rendering him unable to expand his chest cavity to draw in air. Within these brief and agonizing moments, the mechanical asphyxia induced by the severe compression and his inability to breathe sealed his fate. Outside the dam, Eric and the crew frantically scrambled to manage the escalating pressure and find the opened valve. However, despite their desperate efforts, it took them a nerve-wracking 30 minutes to find and finally reach the valve they needed to close. To make matters even worse, the valve was hidden behind a locked door. By then, it was tragically too late. All they could recover from the depths of the dam was Alex's lifeless body and the camera that had captured his futile screams for help, marking a solemn end to a very preventable tragedy. A horrifying video of the last moments of an award-winning photographer has gone viral online over a decade after his untimely death. You may have seen a viral video which first circulated on YouTube in 2013 of a man wearing a horse head prop while being dragged around by a whirlpool, but you may not know what happened just moments later. Acclaimed photographer Jacob Cockle was just 28 when the video was shot, in a bid to make a sensational piece of footage online. Having won awards for his sea photography from the likes of National Geographic and the Sunday Times, Cockle was known for capturing the best shots possible by using increasingly dangerous tactics. Described by those who knew him, he was a daredevil who was obsessed with the ocean. Cockle found his calling in the water, and taking pictures of surfers, boats, and whirlpools. Merely a few times a year, a vortex in Hale Harbor located in Cornwall would appear. To stop the harbor silting up, the Victorians engineered an area where water would be stored in a pool at high tide, and once the tide had retreated, it would be released back into the harbor to wash away the sand. Beneath the quay was a tunnel through which the pool of water would run into, but sometimes the tide would come back in faster than the water could pass through the tunnel. Thus, the whirlpool was created. Jacob's adventurous spirit and the appeal of the swift swirling vortex made him eager to record this event. His plan was to film the action as he swam in the whirlpool despite all the warning signs. The vortex began on May 28th of 2013. With his camera in his hand and already in his wetsuit, Jacob was excited at the prospect of filming the whirlpool once again. His friend David agreed to film him as he swam around the whirlpool. By the time David reached the harbor, Jacob was already in the water. He was wearing a rubber horse's head, a prop he thought would make the video more eye-catching on YouTube. Jacob wanted to make the most of it whilst the whirlpool was still there, despite having shot a lot of footage of this specific vortex in the past. In the video, Jacob swirls around the whirlpool's edge as David films from the quay. You can hear David mention how powerful it looks. Letting the water carry him around again, it tugged Jacob down as it caught him. This was a constant cycle of circling in and out of the whirlpool to get extra footage. After a few minutes, he asked David to pass him a GoPro camera attached to a short pole, as Jacob wanted to get one last shot below the surface. Jacob dove down as David watched, but Jacob didn't reappear.
One last bit underwater first on the day.
Calling his friend's name, David began to worry. He ran across to the other end of the quay where the tunnel of the whirlpool funneled into a flow pool, but there was no sign of Jacob. He then asked a nearby fisherman if he had seen anyone come through, but he hadn't. There was no sign of Jacob as water was churning through the tunnel below. David ran back and forth, and then he saw him. The tunnel had spat Jacob out, and he was in the pool lying face down whilst floating in the water. David swam out to him, but it was too late. Jacob unfortunately drowned after being sucked into the whirlpool. He was a very talented photographer and surfer. All who met him stated he was one of the nicest, friendliest watermen you could meet, and was loved by many. Steve Irwin had a love for all creatures, and his knack for being able to handle them so skillfully soon translated into a full-time career. In 1991, he started managing Birwa Reptile and Fauna Park, which his parents had run since 1970, and eventually changed the name to the Australia Zoo. His larger-than-life enthusiastic personality also paved the way to global television fame, most notably in the TV documentary series The Crocodile Hunter from 1997 to 2004. By July 2006, Irwin was on top of the world. He was married to American Terry Irwin and dad to daughter Bindi and son Robert. Plus, he and Terry had just plotted out a 10-year plan for the Australia Zoo, so when he took off to film a documentary in Queensland's Bott Reef, it just seemed like another adventure. He was already hosted in the 2001 special called The 10 Deadliest Snakes in the World, so the fact that this one was called the ocean's deadliest didn't faze him one bit. After all, he was committed to spreading the word about compassion for all creatures. Unfortunately, this trip didn't go as planned, and resulted in tragedy. The only animal Steve Irwin was afraid of was the parrot, due to numerous incidents where they bit him. However, the animal that actually took his life had a far more docile reputation. Stingrays are usually quite harmless, but on September 4th of 2006, a rare incident involving one caused Irwin's death at the age of 44. Cameraman Justin Lyons was one of Irwin's closest friends. They had worked together for 15 years, and Irwin considered him his best mate and right-hand man. He also knew how excited Irwin was to work on this particular documentary, where they would come face to face with the ocean's deadliest creatures. All the things that would normally make people scared is what Steve loved to do, so he was very excited about this documentary. They were about 8 days into the shoot and were on the search for tiger sharks but hit a patch of bad weather. So the two decided to fill their ruined day, and they jumped into an inflatable boat and went to look for something to do. It didn't take long for them to find a gigantic 8-foot wide stingray that would be perfect footage for another project they had in the future. Like they had many times before, they had a plan and got ready to shoot in the chest-deep waters. Stingrays are normally very calm. If they don't want you around them, they'll swim away, and in the water, filming was going very well, so they figured to do one last shot. The stingray was between the two of them, and Irwin would swim away towards the camera, and Lyons would film the ray swimming. But things didn't go as planned. All of a sudden, it propped on its front and started stabbing wildly with its tail, with rapid strikes in seconds. Lyons remembers noting that the powerful animals had been around for 60 million years. It probably thought Steve's shadow was a tiger shark, so it started to attack him. Even under those circumstances, Lyons focused on his work. They had a rule that if Steve was ever hurt or injured, they had to keep filming no matter what. It wasn't until Lyons turned back that he realized the tail strikes had gone straight into Irwin. Steve was standing in a huge pool of blood, and Lyons realized something had gone terribly wrong. The first priority was to get out of the water since the blood would surely attract sharks. They managed to get Irwin back onto the inflatable boat, with one crew member keeping his hand over the wound, and Lyons reminding Irwin to think of his kids, as he calmly looked up and said, "I'm dying." And that was the last thing he said. When they got back to the main boat called Croc 1, Lyons started CPR on him. But when they finally got him to medics, the prognosis was clear, and they pronounced him dead within 10 seconds of looking at him. After the tragedy, critics came out and said Irwin must have been behaving irresponsibly for something to go so wrong, but toxicologist Jamie Seymour was also on board Croc 1 that day, and says simply that was not true. Even though they were there to look for tiger sharks, Seymour and Irwin had specifically talked about the potential damage that a stinger's tail could do as well. News of Steve Irwin's death spread quickly on the afternoon of September 4th of 2006, prompting sad and shocked reactions from many Australians. The media was filled with Irwin talk, from tributes to discussion of his ambitious conservation plans and sympathy towards his family. The public was also quick to react to the tragic news, showing what a national icon Irwin had become in Australia. The relatively mundane animal that had killed the man, who had survived some of the most dangerous beasts on the planet, prompted disbelief. People were seen with black armbands and Irwin-themed mementos that ranged from wigs and fake crocodiles to replicas of his famed khaki uniform.
The story of Timothy Treadwell, also known as the Grizzly Man, is a very disturbing and unfortunate event that involved a bear attack that took place at Katmai National Park. This park has about 3,000 of the total 35,000 Alaskan grizzly bears. As many know, grizzly bears or brown bears are extremely powerful creatures, growing up to lengths of 7 feet and weighing up to 700 pounds. But Timothy felt a connection to these bears getting way too close multiple times due to a delusional mutual respect. For 13 years, Timothy Treadwell camped in several Alaskan parks, but Katmai National Park was a favorite, crawling and walking up close to bears and filming them, often attempting to touch both cubs and adults. In the 85-year history of the park, no visitor had been killed by a grizzly. Firearms are prohibited within Katmai National Park. Bear spray is allowed, however, Tim had quit carrying bear spray for protection several summers ago. Treadwell often established his camp on or near established bear trails. During his last season, Tim had also hid and camouflaged his camp at the Grizzly Maze within the thick alder bush in an effort to hide from the Park Service. Unfortunately, this is where it took a turn for the worse.
Isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear?
In October 2003, Treadwell and his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, visited Katmai National Park. According to Treadwell's diaries, Amy feared bears and felt very uncomfortable in their presence. Her final journal entries indicated that she wanted to be away from Katmai. Treadwell set his campsite near a salmon stream where wild bears commonly fed in autumn. He was in the park later in the year than normal, at a time when bears attempt to gain as much fat as possible before winter. Food was scarce that fall, causing the bears to be even more aggressive than usual. Timothy and Amy were to leave the park at his usual time of year, and had actually returned to Kodiak on September 26th to store their gear for the season and catch a connecting flight to return to their home in California. However, after an argument with the airline ticketer over the price of altering his return ticket, they both made the decision to return to their campsite on September 29th for an additional week. Treadwell also wanted to locate a favorite female brown bear that he was concerned about. He said he hated modern civilization and felt better in nature with the bears than he did with big cities around humans. The bear he had been used to during the summer had already gone into hibernation, and bears that Treadwell did not know so well from other parts of the park were moving in. Some of the last footage taken by Treadwell hours before his death includes video of a bear diving into the river repeatedly for a piece of dead salmon. Treadwell mentioned in the footage that he did not feel entirely comfortable around that particular bear, and in the documentary Grizzly Man, it speculated on whether Treadwell filmed the very bear that killed him. Around noon on Sunday, October 5th, 2003, Treadwell spoke with an associate in Malibu, California by satellite phone. He mentioned no problems with any bears. The next day, as scheduled at 2 p.m. on Monday, October 6th, air taxi pilot Willie Fulton from Andrew Airways arrives at Kaflia Lake to transport Tim and Amy out of the area for the year, but is approached by a large brown bear. Willie states it was rainy and foggy out that morning. After landing, Willie believes that he sees Tim shaking out the tarp and yells for the couple, but receives no response. He decides to hike up the path from the beach and through the thick alder bush towards the camp after he notices a little bit of movement. When he's about 3/4 of the way up the hill, he senses that something just didn't feel right. Something seems strange. Willie then states that he turned around and headed back down the path through the thick brush, and just as he gets to the plane, he turns around and spots a pretty nasty looking bear, a bear that he had seen on earlier flights. It was sneaking slowly down the trail with its head down. Willie then takes off and flies over the campsite 15 to 20 times in an attempt to chase the bear away, and sees what appears to be the same bear feeding from a human rib cage. But each time he flies over the camp, the bear decides to feed even faster. He then decides to connect with 4 other park rangers, including Ranger Ellis, to investigate what had happened. After exiting the plane, the 4 begin slowly hiking up the path from the lake, yelling as they walk to help locate any surviving victims and to alert any nearby bears of their presence. The visibility was poor with a heavy growth of bushes and tall grass. The camp was located on top of a ridge and out of sight. One ranger turned and saw an adult bear moving towards the group about 20 feet away. All 4 began yelling in hopes that the bear would see them and move away. Ranger Ellis, armed with a handgun, began to fire at the same time as the other rangers, who were each armed with shotguns. They were able to drop the bear 12 feet away. As they moved closer to the campsite, human remains were then found buried. 2 tents were discovered, one for gear and the main one used for sleeping. Both were collapsed and torn. However, there was no evidence that the bear had pulled the victims from the main tent. In front of this main tent was a large mound of mud, grass, and sticks. After moving a clump of dirt, Ranger Ellis later recalled seeing fingers and an arm protruding from the pile. In the 85-year history of Katmai National Park, this was the first known incident of a person being killed by a bear. A video camera recovered at the site proved to have been operating during the attack, but police said that the 6-minute tape contained only voices and cries, as bear number 141 mauled Treadwell to death. The video was later analyzed by Alaskan state troopers. The first sounds from the tape are from Amy. She sounds surprised and asks if it's still out there. Apparently, either Tim had asked Amy to turn on the camera, or Amy just turned it on out of reflex. The point being, the attack was in progress when the camera was turned on. The next voice is from Timothy as he screams to get out of here. The sound of a tent zipper is then heard and the tent flap opening. Amy is heard screaming over the background sounds of rain hitting the tent, the wind, and other storm sounds, all mixed in with the bear and Tim fighting to play dead. Not surprisingly, with Amy yelling and screaming nearby, this seems to work and the bear backs off. A short conversation occurs between Amy and Tim as they try to determine if the bear is really gone. Being trained as a physician's assistant, it's believed that Amy made her way to Tim, and from the sounds caught on tape, the bear returns and Amy is forced to back off. Tim then is clearly heard screaming that playing dead isn't working and begs her to hit the bear. The sound of the rain hitting the tent along with the wind muffle the sounds at this point. However, Amy is clearly heard yelling to fight back. She is then heard screaming, "Stop, go away," as the sound of a frying pan is used to beat the top of the bear's head, and the sound of Tim moaning. It's believed that at this point in the attack, the bear let go of Tim's head and grabbed him somewhere in the upper leg area. The sound of Amy screaming very loudly as Tim is clearly heard over the sounds of the storm saying, "Amy, get away, go away." Tim knew he was going to die at this point and wanted to save Amy from the same fate. The audio portion of this videotape lasts roughly 6 minutes. During this period, Tim's cries and pleading can be heard for 2/3 of that time. He didn't die quickly, unlike some traumatic death victims who were lucky enough to drift off to a shock-induced dream state. Tim was obviously very aware and struggling desperately to survive during the last moments of his life. Unlike what is portrayed in the movies, the bear is nearly silent. Only low growls and periodic grunts are heard, which adds to the horror of the scene. Sounds of the bear dragging Tim off and the fading sounds of the screams indicate that Tim is being pulled and dragged into the bush and away from the camp. As the tape comes to an end, the sounds of Amy's high-pitched screams rise to a new level. Much like what has been described as the sound of a predator call, used by hunters to produce the distressed cries of a small wounded animal, which often attracts bears. Biologist Larry Vandale for the Alaskan Department of Fish and Game theorizes that Amy's screams may have prompted the bear to return and kill her. On Friday, October 8, 2003, 2 days after the investigators first arrived, a necroscopy of the larger bear, or Bear 141, was conducted at the scene by biologist Larry Vandale, where it was learned that the stomach and digestive tract contained human remains and torn pieces of clothing. This event is a very tragic and unfortunate one that could have been avoided, but nonetheless is one of the most disturbing stories anyone has ever heard.